The Vanishing Bridge. In a remote region of Sweden, there was a legend about a bridge that must never be crossed. Those who stepped onto it were said to never return, and if they did, they were no longer themselves. Kenji was a traveler exploring the Nordic landscapes. He had rented a car, driving through forests and lakes, capturing photos along the way. That day he was searching for scenic spots when he noticed something unusual. A bridge? It's not on the map. A small wooden bridge stretched over a mist-covered lake. The bridge was old, its wooden planks worn, and rusted signs stood at both ends. On the sign, faded words were barely visible. "Do not cross." Kenji chuckled. "It's just an old bridge, right?" Curious, he parked his car and walked toward it. The lake was still, eerily silent, without a single ripple. But on the far side of the bridge, the mist thickened into an impenetrable wall. Might as well take a look. He lifted his camera and stepped onto the bridge. As he walked, he noticed something strange. His footsteps made no sound. The wooden planks should have creaked beneath his weight, but his steps were silent. Weird. He turned back. The entrance to the bridge was fading into the mist. It was as if the way back was vanishing. I should turn around. A sense of unease crept over him. He spun on his heel and froze. The bridge had grown longer. What the hell? And the bridge, which had been no more than 10 meters long, now stretched endlessly. The shore was gone, swallowed by the fog, as if the more he walked, the more the bridge extended. This isn't real. He ran, but no matter how far he went, the bridge never ended. Instead, it kept leading him deeper into the mist. Then, someone stood at the end of the bridge. A silhouette emerged from the fog. "Who's there?" He tried to call out, but his throat tightened. The figure was wearing the exact same clothes as Kenji. The shadow slowly lifted a hand. It moved, just slightly behind Kenji's own movements, like a delayed reflection. What the hell is this? A cold chill ran down his spine. The figure took a step forward. Kenji instinctively took a step back, and then the figure stepped back too. The silence deepened. Kenji's heartbeat pounded in his ears, and then the figure's face twisted, slowly, as if it were smiling. Kenji screamed and ran. The fog swirled, his vision blurred into white, and then he collapsed onto the lakeshore. The sun had risen, and the fog had vanished. Kenji gasped for air and turned back toward the bridge, but there was nothing. The bridge had never existed. It was as if it had never been there at all. With shaking hands, he checked his camera, but there were no photos of the bridge. Instead, the last picture taken was a shot of Kenji's own back, a picture he had never taken. The footsteps in the forest. Deep in the forests of Canada, there was a legend about a path where one must never turn around. Those who walked it would always hear footsteps behind them, but no matter what, they must never look back, because those who did never returned. Takuya was a seasoned hiker exploring Canada's vast wilderness. He enjoyed discovering lesser-known trails, places untouched by crowds. That day, he found a narrow, unmarked path. This looks interesting. The path was overgrown, shrouded by thick trees, making it dark even in the daytime. Yet, the fallen leaves suggested that someone had walked there recently. Cautiously, he stepped forward. But minutes later, he noticed something strange. Footsteps. Crunch, crunch. The sound came from behind him. At first he thought it was an echo of his own steps. But then, the footsteps continued. even after he stopped walking. "Is someone there?" He turned his head slightly, but his instincts screamed not to look. He wasn't alone, but he couldn't see anyone. And yet, crunch, crunch. The footsteps were getting closer. The wind had stopped. The birds had gone silent. The world around him was completely still, except for the footsteps circling him. He could feel it. Something was right next to him, but there was no shadow. "Stay still. Don't turn around." His heart pounded as he shut his eyes. Then, a whisper brushed against his ear. "Why won't you look at me?" Takuya bolted. He ran, faster than he ever had before, and the footsteps, they ran with him. As long as he didn't turn back, he would be fine. But then, the path split into two, left or right. Which one led to safety? He hesitated, and in that moment, a cold hand touched his shoulder. The next thing he knew, he was on the ground. Opening his eyes, he found himself back at the entrance of the forest. "I made it." The morning sun filtered through the trees, the world peaceful again. But something was wrong. He looked down. There were no footprints, not a single mark in the dirt where he had walked, as if he had never been there at all. Since that day, Takuya never paid attention to footsteps in the forest again, because he could still feel someone walking behind him. The Shadowed Inn. In a remote village in Romania, there was a small inn. It was an old stone building, said to have welcomed travelers for centuries. Erica, a solo traveler, stumbled upon it while passing through the countryside. "This place has a nice atmosphere." The inn was situated away from the town center, surrounded by silence. A weathered sign hung above the door, reading, "Casa Umbrelor," the House of Shadows. Without hesitation, Erica pushed open the door. Inside, the inn was surprisingly warm and inviting. Soft lantern light flickered against the stone walls, and at the reception desk stood a tall man. "Welcome," he greeted her with a calm smile. There was nothing unusual about him, yet something about his presence felt slightly off. "I'd like a room for the night." "Of course, but..." He paused, still smiling. "At night, please pay no attention to the shadows in your room." "Shadows?" "Yes. Sometimes they move in strange ways, but this is an old building. It's nothing to worry about. Just rest well." With the key in hand, Erica made her way upstairs to her room. It was simple. A bed, a wooden desk, and a single window overlooking the quiet street. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Tired from her travels, she took a quick shower and collapsed onto the bed. Outside, the moonlight shone down, casting long shadows against the walls. Then, she noticed it. Something was wrong with her shadow. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe the lantern's flickering was making it move strangely. But no, it was delayed. She raised her left hand. Her shadow followed, as it should have, but just a fraction of a second too late. And its fingers moved slightly differently. No. A strange unease crept over her. Then she remembered the innkeeper's words. "Pay no attention to the shadows." Easier said than done. The shadow swayed slightly, as if something inside it was alive. Erica exhaled sharply and got up. If she wasn't supposed to notice the shadows, she could just turn off the light. She reached for the lantern switch. Darkness filled the room. And then, creak, a soft, deliberate footstep. Her breath caught in her throat. She was alone, but something was moving in the dark.
Is someone there? Silence. Yet, she could feel something shifting. Quickly, she turned the lantern back on. Light flooded the room, and on the wall, her shadow was facing her. A scream tore from her lips as she ran for the door. She pulled at the handle. It wouldn't open. "Let me out!" She pounded on the wood, but no one came. Behind her, the shadow moved closer. It wasn't lagging anymore. Now, it was moving first. Her body was simply following. The next thing Erica knew, she was standing outside the inn. The sun had risen. Everything was quiet. She turned back toward the door. The wooden sign still hung above it, but the name had vanished. The letters were gone, as if they had never been there at all. She looked down. Her shadow stretched along the ground. It moved exactly as she did, except for one thing. It was smiling.
The Red Door. I was wandering through a small village in Spain. Narrow alleyways, ancient stone houses, and dry air carrying the scent of history. By day, the town was lively with a bustling market, but by evening, the streets became eerily silent. I wandered through the empty paths, taking photos, when I stumbled upon something unusual. A red door. It stood alone, embedded in an old stone wall at the end of a deserted alley. It didn't belong to a house. It had no handle, no keyhole, just a smooth, polished red surface. It looked new, far too new compared to the crumbling walls around it. Yet at the same time, it carried an unsettling sense of age. Curious, I reached out and touched it. Cold, colder than it should have been under the warm Spanish sun. I raised my camera, ready to take a picture. Thud. Something knocked from the inside. I stumbled backward. Someone was inside? Impossible. Behind this door there should have been nothing but solid stone. Yet, thud. A second knock, louder. And then, scratching. A slow, deliberate sound of nails dragging against wood. I turned and walked away. My heart was hammering. I stepped back into the main street where the town's normal sounds returned. The murmur of locals, the distant clatter of dishes from a cafe. Everything felt normal again. I forced myself to turn and look back. The alley was still there, and at the end of it, the red door remained. The next morning, I decided to check again. I retraced my steps, found the alley, but the red door was gone. Only an unbroken stone wall remained. I ran my hands over it, searching for some hidden seam, some trace that it had been there, but it was as if the door had never existed. I left the village that afternoon. Returning to my hotel, I locked the door behind me, took a long shower, trying to shake off the lingering unease, wiped the steam from the bathroom mirror, and froze. In the reflection behind me, the red door was there. I spun around. Nothing. Just the plain white wall of my hotel room. But when I looked back at the mirror, the door was still in the reflection. A single impossible detail had changed. There was a handle now. Click. The handle in the mirror began to turn. Panic surged through me. The door in the reflection slowly creaked open. Blackness filled the space beyond it. But something was in there, watching. Then, thud. A loud knock. I threw a towel over the mirror, my hands shaking. When I finally gathered the courage to look again, the red door was gone. The next day, I left the village. As I passed by, a few locals watched me in silence. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. I could see it in their eyes. They knew. I drove for hours, reaching the outskirts of the next city. Night fell. Before stepping out of the car, I glanced at my rearview mirror, and there, the red door was waiting. I floored the accelerator, didn't look back, didn't stop. But as I sped down the empty highway, thud, the sound came from the back seat. For days, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that it was all in my head. But one night, as I lay in bed, staring at the dark corner of my room, I saw it. The red door. No handle, no keyhole. But as I watched, a handle slowly began to form, and this time, I knew it was for me. The bottom of the well. I had come to a village in Poland for my university research, a study on a village that disappeared due to an epidemic. This village had once thrived as a trading hub, but at some point in history, its people had vanished without a trace. The cause was unknown. The only written record left behind simply stated that the villagers had been trapped in the well. When I asked the locals about it, they all reacted the same way. Their faces darkened, their voices lowered, and they refused to speak further. The old well is deep in the forest. You must never go near it. They all gave the same warning. And yet, hearing such things only made me more curious. I studied the maps, packed my gear, and set off toward the forest. The path leading into the forest was overgrown, barely visible under the dense foliage. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became. Even though it was midday, the thick canopy above blocked out much of the sunlight. There were no birds, no insects, just an eerie silence. Then, after what felt like an hour of walking, the trees suddenly cleared, and there it was, a lone, forgotten well, standing in the middle of the clearing. Its stone rim was cracked and covered in moss, eroded by time, yet strangely the inside was spotless. No fallen leaves, no dirt, nothing, as if someone had been keeping it clean. I hesitated, then leaned over and peered inside. Darkness. I couldn't see the bottom. Curious, I picked up a small rock and dropped it into the well. I waited. No sound. That wasn't right. I should have heard something. Water. Stone hitting the walls. An echo. But there was nothing. I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it down into the well. The beam of light was swallowed by the darkness, revealing nothing. Frowning, I placed one hand on the well's rim and leaned forward slightly. And then, rustle. A faint sound. I froze. Was that the wind? Number. The well was far too deep for the wind to reach the bottom. I held my breath, listening. Rustle. Rustle. Something was moving down there. A wave of unease washed over me. I didn't know how or why, but my body was screaming at me to leave. I took a step back, and then, scrape. A slow, deliberate sound. Something was climbing up the walls of the well. My blood turned to ice. I stumbled backward. Something was coming up. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Down in the abyss, in that unnatural darkness. There were eyes. Two faint, glimmering points in the shadows fixed on me. Not just watching. Advancing. I ran. Branches tore at my face. Leaves crunched underfoot as I sprinted through the forest, my breath ragged. But behind me, scrape, scrape. The sound of something pulling itself upward. Run, run, run. The clearing, the village, so far away. And then, a whisper, right next to my ear. Come down. I burst out of the forest, tripping onto the village's dirt path. Panting, I looked back. Nothing. The forest was still. No movement, no figures emerging from the trees. Just silence. Had I imagined it? Was it all in my head? My hands were trembling. Then I looked down, and my heart stopped. Mud. Fresh mud, clinging to the soles of my shoes. The same mud that had coated the well's walls. I left the village soon after. I didn't include the well in my research report. It was just a superstition, I told myself. Nothing more. But even now, some nights I hear it. Scrape. Scrape. Like something is looking for me. Years later, I returned to Poland for another project. I had no intention of visiting that village again. But one evening, while staying in a hotel, I happened to glance out the window and saw something that made my blood run cold. A well, standing alone against the building across the street. Impossible. There had been no well there before. I stared. And then the well shifted. No, something was crawling out. And before I could react, knock knock. The door to my hotel room trembled. The midnight bus. I was on a business trip in a South American country. The meeting had run late, and by the time I left, taxis were nowhere to be found. With no other options, I decided to take the midnight bus back to my hotel. A local colleague had warned me, be careful with the buses at night. But I was exhausted. I didn't care. I paid my fare and sat in the back row. There were only a few other passengers. The dimly lit interior was filled with the soft hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the brakes. The bus moved quietly through the darkened streets. Outside, there was little to see, just the occasional flicker of streetlights. At the next stop, a passenger got off, and at that moment, a sudden chill ran down my spine. The bus hadn't changed. The temperature hadn't dropped. But the air inside suddenly felt heavier. I glanced up at the rearview mirror and froze. There was one more passenger than before. Someone was sitting in the back row, a man in black clothing, head bowed, motionless. He hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The seat had just been emptied, and yet, there he was. I swallowed hard. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe I hadn't been paying attention. But something about him felt wrong. Another stop. A young woman got off, and once again, a new passenger appeared. Same seat. This time, a shadowy figure of a woman. Head down, completely still. My heart pounded. I was imagining this, right? Then, thud. Something hit the back of my seat. I turned sharply. No one was there. I was the only one in the back row. But something was wrong. The hairs on my neck stood up. I looked at the driver's rearview mirror again, and this time, I saw it. There was something sitting directly behind me. I stopped breathing. It shouldn't be there, but it was. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't move. The sound of slow, shallow breathing filled my ears. I needed to get off this bus. Now. Another stop. Someone else left. And as expected, another shadow took their place. More and more seats were filling up. The entire middle section of the bus was now occupied by those things. They sat in perfect silence, unmoving. At the next stop, I was getting off. No matter what. The bus finally stopped. I leaped from my seat and rushed to the door. "Excuse me, I need to get off." The driver said nothing. Slowly the doors opened. I stumbled down the steps and turned back. Through the bus window, I saw the darkened interior. And there, in the very seat where I had just been sitting, I saw myself. I was still on the bus, surrounded by those shadowed figures. I watched as the other me slowly lifted his head and stared straight at me. A slow, eerie smile spread across his face. Then, the door shut, and the bus drove away. The next day, I did some research on that route. I found an article. 10 years ago, a bus had veered off the road and plunged into a canyon. No one survived. And sometimes, on quiet nights, that bus still appeared. I don't take buses anymore. But every so often, late at night, I hear the distant sound of an engine rumbling in the dark, and I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't gotten off? Would I still be here? Or would I be sitting in that seat, waiting for the next passenger to take my place? The cabin guest. I was traveling alone through Romania. Crossing the Carpathian Mountains, I decided to spend the night in an unmanned mountain cabin along the trail. The villagers had warned me, never make a sound in the mountains at night. Something might come. They refused to explain further, but I dismissed it as local superstition. I continued on my way to the cabin. The cabin was simple but solid. Stone walls, a wooden door, creaking floors. There was enough firewood for the stove, and after a simple meal, I lit the fire and spread out my map. I planned my route for the next day, then crawled into my sleeping bag early, but deep into the night, a sound woke me up. Creak, creak. Footsteps in the hallway. Someone was inside the cabin. That wasn't possible. This cabin was deep in the mountains, far from any town or village. I held my breath, listening. Creak, creak. Slow, deliberate steps, moving through the cabin. This wasn't the wind. Someone was walking inside. Gripping my flashlight, I slowly slid out of my sleeping bag. I aimed the light toward the hallway. No one was there. But on the old wooden floor, wet footprints, barefoot prints. Why wet? This was a dry mountain. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been walking inside. I needed to leave. Now. Then thud. Right outside my door, something stopped. I froze. A shadow stretched under the door. Someone was standing there, watching. "Who's there?" I forced the words out. No reply, but the doorknob began to turn. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I shut off my flashlight and slipped back into my sleeping bag, barely breathing. The door creaked open. Scree. Soft footsteps. Slow. Something entered the room. It stopped beside my bed. I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't look. Couldn't move. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Then, the footsteps turned back. They moved down the hall, fading into the cabin. Silence. I was still alive, but I couldn't move. If I did, I felt like it would come back. At sunrise, I finally sat up. The cabin was still. I packed my things quickly, eager to leave. But before stepping outside, I hesitated. I checked the hallway floor. The footprints were gone, as if they had never existed. Back in the village, I told the old men what had happened. One of them spoke quietly. That was a lost soul of the mountain. For centuries, it was believed that the spirits of those who perished in the mountains still wandered the cabins at night. If they sensed the presence of the living, they would try to take them. You were lucky to escape. A deep shudder ran through me. What I had felt in that cabin, it wasn't human. I never returned to the Romanian mountains, but sometimes, in my dreams, I feel something standing behind a door, waiting, and slowly turning the doorknob. The Distorted Festival. I was traveling through Ethiopia when I stumbled upon a small village festival. It wasn't in any guidebook, and there were no tourists, just locals dressed in traditional attire, beating drums and dancing under the open sky. A rare, authentic experience. I took out my camera and snapped a few shots. That's when I felt it. Someone was watching me. At the center of the festival, one man wasn't dancing. He was wrapped in a long robe, his face covered by a black cloth. Even though his eyes were hidden, I could feel his gaze locked onto me. A strange unease settled in my chest. I turned to a nearby villager. "What is this festival about?" The elderly man smiled. "This is a welcoming ceremony." "A welcome for what?" "For those who come from far away." His words made little sense, but I chuckled and nodded. Then, boom, boom. The drums stopped. The villagers' smiles disappeared. The air became heavy, suffocating. The robed man slowly stood up. Then he walked toward me. No one else moved. It was as if they were waiting for something. The man stopped a few feet away and spread his arms, as if inviting me. "What?" I took a step back. The old man beside me whispered, his voice barely audible. "Leave now." "What?" "This festival is not for you." A shiver ran down my spine. I turned back to the villagers. Every single one of them was staring at me now. Their faces were blank, expressionless. "I think I should go," I muttered. I turned toward the path out of the village. The moment I did, boom, boom, the drums began playing again, but no one was hitting them. I looked over my shoulder. The villagers all tilted their heads at the exact same angle. Their movements were too synchronized, too unnatural. I bolted. The only way out was a long dirt path leading away from the village. Behind me, the drums grew louder. Boom, 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 boom. And then laughter, twisted, overlapping voices that sounded like both joy and agony. I turned back, and no one was there. Relief flooded my chest, but then I saw it. Standing in the center of the festival grounds was me. A second me stood where I had just been. He was staring directly at me. I couldn't move. My other self opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His mouth was just a hollow black void. And then he reached out toward me. My vision went dark. I woke up alone. The village was gone. There was nothing but an abandoned clearing, dust swirling in the wind. Had it been a dream? No, because my camera was still clutched in my hand. With shaking fingers, I checked the last photo I had taken. It showed the villagers encircling me, and in the middle, I was there. I left Ethiopia soon after. When I tried researching the festival, I found nothing. That village didn't exist, but one thing I know for certain, that festival was for me. And if I hadn't run, would I still be here now? Or is the one standing here really me? The Sunken City. I had been traveling through central Vietnam, wandering through ancient towns, bustling markets, and riverside villages. Hoi An was beautiful, with its lantern-lit streets and floating candles drifting on the Thu Bon River. But after days of sightseeing, I craved something different, something off the beaten path. That's how I ended up in a remote fishing village, far from the usual tourist spots. The village was simple, rows of stilt houses, wooden boats bobbing along the shore, and the smell of fresh seafood grilling over charcoal. I sat at a food stall, drinking iced coffee, thick with condensed milk. when an old fisherman spoke to me. "You are not from here," he said. I smiled. "Just passing through." He stared at me for a moment, then said, "You should not go to the lake." I hadn't mentioned a lake. I leaned forward. "Why not?" His eyes flickered toward the distance. "There is a city beneath the water," he murmured. "A place that once lived, but now waits." According to the old man, the lake was once a thriving city, a center of trade, but centuries ago floods swallowed it whole. The people left, he said, but something remained. He told me that some of the old buildings still jutted from the surface. "You can go if you want," he added. Then, after a pause, "but do not stay past sunset." I rented a small boat and set out across the lake. The water was unnaturally still. Even as I rowed, the surface barely rippled. After a while, I saw them. Crumbled rooftops, stone pillars, fragments of a city, half swallowed by the water. I drifted closer, fascinated. The thought that an entire town lay beneath me sent a chill down my spine. I lifted my camera, focused, and pressed the shutter. Click. The sound echoed across the water. And then, behind me, something moved. I turned sharply. A ripple spread across the lake, like something had just submerged. I squinted. Between the ruined structures, something was shifting. A figure. At first, I thought it was my reflection. But no, it was walking, underwater. My breath caught. The figure took slow, deliberate steps, moving against the current. It wasn't floating, it wasn't swimming, it was walking through the drowned city. Then, it turned its head toward me. I couldn't move. My body knew before my mind did. It had no face, just a black void, empty and staring. I gripped the oars, my hands slick with sweat. Then, hands broke the surface. Pale, reaching. Dozens of them. They emerged from the water like blossoms unfurling in slow motion. I couldn't breathe. Something gripped my boat. The wood groaned as the weight of unseen hands dragged it down. I lurched forward, almost tipping over. I had to get out. I rowed desperately, but the water fought back. It felt heavier, thicker, pulling me in. Beneath me the figures rose, faceless, silent, watching. Then one of them floated to the surface, right next to my boat. It tilted its head, a perfect imitation of me. And then it climbed aboard. The world twisted. My vision blurred. I couldn't tell if I was in the boat or in the water anymore. I gasped. Water filled my lungs. No, I wasn't in the boat. I was sinking. The last thing I saw was the city below. Half-buried buildings, figures standing among them, and all of them were looking up. I woke up coughing on the shore. The lake was still again. The boat drifted, untouched. But my body felt heavy, like something had been holding me down. I stood up shakily and left. I never looked back. The Night Walkers. I was deep in Kenya's countryside, far from the city, where roads faded into dirt paths, and the land stretched endlessly beneath the burning sky. I had come to witness a rare tribal ritual, one that few outsiders had ever seen. In a small village, I heard whispers of an old legend. At night, the walkers cross the land. They do not show themselves, but they are always moving. Do not look for them. Do not call out to them. They are not human. It sounded like superstition, until that night. The village changed after sundown. Doors were locked, windows shut. Even the lamps were extinguished early. No one walked outside after dark. "They sleep early here," I muttered. The village elder shook his head. "Night is not for the living to walk." "Why not?" His face darkened. "Because they are crossing." Midnight. I couldn't sleep. The air was cool, the sky wide and cloudless. I stepped outside, drawn by the quiet. At the edge of the village, the vast savanna stretched into the darkness. Nothing moved. Only the wind carried across the dry land. This is ridiculous. Then I looked down, and I froze. There were footprints. Fresh tracks, imprinted in the dry earth, many of them, but I had been outside only minutes ago, and there had been nothing. A chill crept up my spine. The footprints cut across the village in a straight line, like something or someone had passed through. Yet I had seen no one. I turned to head back, and then the wind changed. Shf, shf. Footsteps, not mine. Soft, deliberate, approaching. I held my breath. The sound grew closer, but there was no one there. Shf, shf. The footsteps stopped, right in front of me. I should have been staring at someone standing inches away, but the space was empty. Goosebumps crawled across my skin. I couldn't move. Then my shadow shifted. It bent slightly, as if something was standing beside me. I felt it, a presence, close, watching, and then, right next to my ear, I heard it, a breath. Panic took hold. I didn't dare turn my head, but in the dust below I saw it. New footprints appeared, right where I was standing. Something was standing next to me, and then a whisper. "Who are you?" I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my hut. I never looked back. Nothing followed. But since that night, my shadow moves just a second too late. The Mud House. I was traveling through Nigeria, drawn to the country's unique mud brick architecture. The traditional houses, built entirely of earth, had an ancient beauty to them, structures shaped by time, wind, and rain. With a local guide, I visited a remote village known for its well-preserved mud houses. "The homes here have stood for over a century," the guide explained, leading me through the settlement. The villagers were warm and welcoming, children running past with laughter. But one old man stood apart watching me in silence. When I met his gaze, he spoke, his voice low and firm. "Do not enter that house." At the edge of the village stood a darkened mud house. Like the others, it was built of sun-dried earth, but its walls were unnaturally blackened. The door was shut. The windows were small, giving the impression that the house wanted nothing to do with the outside world. "Does someone still live here?" I asked the guide. He hesitated before answering. "Someone used to." "And now?" "Now no one. But I could feel something inside." "Would it be all right if I take a look?" The guide frowned, but did not stop me. Slowly I pushed the door open. Creak. A heavy groan echoed through the silence. Inside, it was pitch dark. No light filtered in. And yet, a shadow moved at the back of the room. "Hello?" The moment I spoke, scrape. Something shifted. The guide inhaled sharply. "We should go. Now." "But that is not a person." A chill ran through me. The shadow began to move, a slow, dragging motion across the dirt floor. I took a step back. The guide's voice trembled. "Do not look at it." But I couldn't stop myself. My eyes lowered. The shadow's feet, were sinking into the ground. It had the shape of a person, but it was not human. Its surface was shifting. Not skin, not flesh, just mud. And then it turned its face toward me. It had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a sluggish, shifting form, dripping with thick black earth. "Run!" the guide shouted. I bolted. Shoving the door open, I stumbled into the light. The guide was right behind me. I turned. The house was silent once more. The doorway was a gaping black void, but just before the door closed on its own, I saw it, a fresh handprint pressed against the mud wall from inside, as if something was trying to push its way out. The White Hill. I was traveling through northern Argentina, deep in the Andean foothills. A remote village stood alone in the dry, thin air, its sun-dried brick houses blending into the land. I had come to study local folklore, stories passed down through generations. The villagers were warm, welcoming, but they all gave me the same warning. Do not go to the White Hill. If you see it at night, look away. Those who walk there are not human. It sounded like superstition, until the night I saw it for myself. The White Hill stood just beyond the village. During the day, it was nothing more than a rocky slope, but at night, the villagers whispered, a figure appeared there. The hill was once a place of sacrifice, the village elder told me, his voice hushed. Even now, the ones who were given walk the land. If you see them, they will see you. That night, I looked out from my window, and I saw it. A figure, standing motionless atop the hill, bathed in cold moonlight. It was human-shaped, but it swayed. There was no wind, yet it shifted, moving slightly, unnaturally. A trick of the light. I leaned forward, squinting, and then it turned toward me. My heart stopped. It was far away, yet somehow I knew it had seen me. And then it began to descend. I could not move. It had been standing atop the hill. Now it was halfway down, then closer and closer, until I realized it was walking toward my window. I tore the curtain shut and threw myself onto the bed. Silence. No wind, no sound. But then, rustling. Right outside. Something was there, moving, just beyond the window. I pulled the blanket over my head. Don't look, don't look. Then, tap. A soft, dry tap against the glass. Then another. Tap, tap, slow, rhythmic, like bones against glass. It wants to come in. I clenched my teeth. I would not move. I would not look. But my hand was reaching for the curtain. Fingertips brushed the fabric. Something inside me needed to look. But just before I could, a pale shape pressed against the curtain. I snapped my eyes shut. The sound of breathing. Close. So close. It had found me. It was right here. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that, but when I opened my eyes, dawn had come. I hesitated, then pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Only an empty, sunlit landscape, except a single white handprint remained on the glass. The Voice in the Valley. I was traveling through Romania, deep in the Carpathian Mountains. A small village lay hidden in the mist, surrounded by steep cliffs and thick forests. The locals warned me of a place in the valley. Never answer the voices. Even if someone calls your name, do not respond. If you do, you will never return. I thought it was just superstition, until one night I heard my own name from the valley. I was staying in an old inn at the village's edge. The wooden floors creaked, and the fire in the hearth flickered weakly. The villagers were kind, but at night a strange silence fell over the place. "You shouldn't go outside after dark," the innkeeper warned. "Why?" "Because the valley wakes up." Something about the way he said it lingered in my mind. Midnight. I couldn't sleep. I glanced out the window. A sea of white mist swirled through the valley below. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic. Before I knew it, I had stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin as I followed the cobbled path toward the valley. Then, someone called my name. "Takashi." I froze. The voice came from the mist. Familiar, but I couldn't remember whose it was. The innkeeper's words echoed in my mind. "Never answer the voices." I stood still. The mist trembled. Takashi. Again. Closer. Something was coming from the depths of the valley, but there was nothing there. The footsteps grew louder. "Takashi, why are you ignoring me?" A whisper, right next to my ear. Panic surged through me. I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to turn around. But then, a terrible thought crept into my mind. How did it know my name? Beyond the mist, something moved. A shadow. As the fog briefly parted, I saw it. It was me. The figure standing in the mist looked exactly like me, but the eyes were wrong. Dark, empty, and it was smiling. "Takashi." It reached out its hand. I staggered backward. Then, the mist came alive. Dozens of white hands rose from the ground, dragging, crawling. "Say your name. Answer us." The whispers tangled around me, suffocating. I squeezed my eyes shut and ran. I didn't stop running until I crashed through the inn's doors. The fire had nearly died. The innkeeper stared at me for a long moment. Then he simply said, "You heard them, didn't you?" I couldn't answer. By morning, the valley was clear. But when I looked down from the village, I saw them. Footprints, dozens of them, leading deep into the valley, even to places I had never walked. The Red Sand Path. I was traveling through Morocco. From Marrakesh, I had taken a long bus ride, then switched to a jeep, heading deep into the arid lands where small villages stood against the endless Sahara. Sun-dried mud houses, the golden dunes stretching to infinity. I was sitting in the village market sipping mint tea when I asked an old man, "Is there any unusual place around here?" He studied me for a long moment before replying, "Do not walk the red sand path." Why? Those who do never return. The red sand path was a narrow trail beyond the village, cutting through the dunes. They said that shadows appear there, ones that do not belong to you. "It is the path of those who walked before you," the old man said. "If your shadow changes, you will never find your way back." It sounded like nothing more than a legend. But the next day, I found myself walking that path. The trail stretched endlessly under the scorching sun. Unlike the surrounding sand, this path was distinctly red. The heat made the air shimmer. The only sound was the soft hiss of sand shifting in the wind. "It's just a desert road," I muttered, and then I noticed it. There were two shadows. One was mine. The other was ahead of me. I stopped. The sun was behind me, meaning my shadow should be stretching forward. But the second shadow, it wasn't aligned with me. It was moving ahead, like it was leading the way. "Just an illusion," I whispered. I took another step. The shadow moved too, but slightly before me, like I was the one following it. I need to turn back. I turned, and my breath caught. The road behind me was gone. No footprints, no village, just miles of red sand. This isn't real. Sweat trickled down my back. I turned again. The shadow was still there, still ahead. And then the wind shifted, the sand swirled, and the shadow turned to face me. It was human-shaped, but featureless. It stood there, blocking my path. The wind died down. Silence returned, and I realized it was no longer my shadow. "Who are you?" I murmured. At those words, it moved. It took a step forward. It made no sound. Only the sand darkened beneath its feet, and then its feet overlapped with mine. My vision blurred. A ringing filled my ears. The world distorted, and the shadow was gone. I woke up in the village. The market was bustling. The old man sat before me, just as he had before. "You came back?" he asked. I opened my mouth, my lips dry. I walked the path. The old man shook his head. "You never left." I looked down. No footprints, nothing to prove I had ever walked anywhere. But then, for just a moment, my shadow moved slightly too late. The drowning town. I was traveling through Java, Indonesia. A small town nestled between volcanoes and dense jungle. The market was alive with the scent of spices, the hum of conversation, the warmth of life. But the locals spoke of a place where no one dared to go. Never step into the drowning town. At night, voices rise from beneath the ground. What lingers there is not among the living. It sounded like folklore, but I saw the town myself. At the edge of the town, there was a lake. Its surface was still, mirroring the sky. "This used to be a village," a local man told me. "An earthquake took it?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. One night the entire village just disappeared." A half-submerged stone road led into the water. The path was old, cracked, but it didn't stop at the water's edge. It kept going, straight into the lake, as if the road still led somewhere. That night, the lake was silent. The stars stretched endlessly above, their light reflecting on the still water. And I wondered, if the town is down there, maybe something remains? I stepped forward, testing the old stone beneath my feet, and then someone was walking beneath the water. The ripples barely moved, but I could hear it. Footsteps, slow, steady, coming closer, but nothing should be walking underwater. The sound grew louder. Something was approaching from deep within the lake. I held my breath. A shadow flickered across the surface. It was human-shaped, but its feet were buried in the lake bed as it moved. "Who's there?" The words left my lips before I could stop them. The shadow froze, and then another set of footsteps began. This time, right behind me. I shouldn't turn around. I knew that, but it was already too late. I looked at my reflection in the water, and beside it, there was another shadow. It wasn't mine. It moved, closer, aligning itself with my own, like it was trying to become me. The cold spread from my feet. The lake had risen. The water was now at my knees. I tried to back away, but from beneath the surface, hands began to rise. Pale fingers reached upward. A whisper drifted through the air. "Go back." The voice, it was my own. When I came to, I was lying at the water's edge. Dawn had started to break, but the lake's surface still rippled, and though I wasn't looking anymore, I could feel that something was still looking at me. The Vanishing Village. I was just a traveler, exploring Eastern Europe, stopping in small towns along the way. This one wasn't a tourist hotspot, just a quiet village with old stone houses and a still lake. "Is there anything interesting to see around here?" I asked at the hotel reception. A young man behind the desk smirked. "If you go past the forest, there's an old village." An old village? It was abandoned long ago. Nothing left but ruins. An abandoned village sounded intriguing. The next day, I set off to find it. The path leading there was narrow, winding through dense trees. Even in daylight, the forest felt unnaturally dim. "Are you sure this is the way?" I checked my map. Another 30 minutes of walking, and finally, I stepped out of the trees and saw a perfectly intact village. What? Neatly arranged houses, a dirt road stretching between them. In the distance, I heard a cow lowing. But this place was supposed to be abandoned. I hesitated, then walked into the village. Old stone houses, their windows open to the breeze. A well stood in the village square, its water still. Thin wisps of smoke curled from a few chimneys. Someone had to be here, but there was no one. "Hello?" No answer. A line of laundry swayed on a rope. A table sat outside a house, a cup half filled with tea resting on it, as if someone had just been there moments ago. "Excuse me? Is anyone here?" I stepped deeper into the village. But still, not a single person appeared. At the village center stood a large building. It looked like a church. The doors were slightly ajar. I hesitated, then pushed them open. There were people inside. They sat in the pews, 10 or so of them, their backs straight, all facing the altar, but none of them moved. Hello?" The moment I spoke, they all stood up at once. There were no sound, no creaking wood, no footsteps. Just, they turned to look at me. I couldn't breathe, because they had no faces. Their skin was smooth, no eyes, no mouths, no features at all. And yet, I knew they were looking at me. I had to run. But before I could move, the village bell rang. Goong! A deep, hollow chime. The ground trembled slightly, and when I looked back, the road I had taken was gone. I bolted, racing through the empty streets, past the silent houses, but the forest was no longer there. This isn't possible. My breath came in ragged gasps. I turned. The village was fading. The buildings were dissolving, their edges turning to mist, and standing in the last remnants of it were the faceless people watching me. And when I woke up, I was lying at the forest's edge. The sun was setting. I made it back. I stood on shaking legs and turned, but the village was gone. The next day, I asked the hotel receptionist about it, but he only frowned and said, "There's no village around here." I couldn't respond, but later, as I looked at my reflection in the hotel window, I noticed something. For just a split second, my shadow moved too late. The train that passes. I was traveling through Thailand. After a long bus ride from Bangkok, I arrived in a small town deep in the countryside. I wandered through the markets, tried local food, and visited temples. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but when I spoke with the owner of my guest house, I heard something strange. There's a road in this town where a train still passes. A train track? No, the tracks were removed years ago, but people still see the train. The road wasn't on any map, just a stretch of unpaved red dirt leading into the forest. I followed it as the sun began to set. There was no wind, no birds, just the distant sound of metal scraping against metal. No way. I kept walking. The dirt beneath my feet became firmer, and then I saw wooden planks buried in the ground. Old, decayed, they looked like remnants of railway ties. And ahead, a railroad crossing appeared. A broken, rotting wooden gate. The barriers were collapsed. The signs were rusted. It looked untouched for decades. Yet on the ground, fresh tire-like tracks ran straight through it, as if something had just passed. Impossible. I hesitated. Then, ding, ding. The distant sound of a railway crossing bell. There's no track here. I turned around. Nothing but an empty dirt road. It had to be in my head. I took another step forward, and then a gust of wind hit me like a wall. A deep roar filled the air. The sound of metal. The sound of something massive, rushing forward. I jumped back, and saw it. A train passed right in front of me. It was real, but there were no tracks. The train moved as if gliding on invisible rails. Yet the worst part, there were no passengers. Inside the windows, shadows shifted and writhed. And then I realized the train was stopping. A shriek of brakes, a low hum as it slowed down, like it was waiting for me. I backed away. I had to run. But then something stood behind me. A voice close to my ear. "Are you getting on?" I froze. I couldn't turn around. I knew someone was there, but it wasn't human. The train came to a complete stop. The doors slid open. Inside was nothing. Just endless blackness. Not an empty train car. Just void. Something inside was watching me. My legs locked in place. If I didn't move, I would be pulled inside. Then, ding, ding. The sound of the crossing bell rang, and the train vanished. Silence returned. The crossing was gone. The tracks were gone. I stood there, breathless. What was that? The next morning I told the guest house owner about it. He only shook his head. There's no road like that here. But I saw there was a railway there, long ago. A chill ran down my spine, that from my window I heard it again. Ding, ding. Disconnected connection. I was just another traveler, hopping through Latin America, working remotely from cafes along the way. That day was no different. I was sitting in an old cafe, sipping coffee, typing away on my laptop. The Wi-Fi had been stable, but suddenly, the connection dropped. Not again. I was used to unreliable free Wi-Fi. I sighed and stood up to check the router, but then I noticed the guy at the next table was staring at his phone, whispering. "Mine's down too." Soon murmurs spread through the cafe. Everyone had lost their connection. But strangely, No one's phone had actually gone offline. The Wi-Fi symbol was gone, yet the signal bar was still full. Connected, it said. But nothing would load. Maybe a reboot will fix it. I powered off my phone. The screen faded to black, then lit up again. Connection established. The Wi-Fi was back, but something was wrong. The browser opened automatically. It looked normal, except the text wasn't quite right. It was a strange mix of English and Spanish, the grammar subtly off. A glitch? I tried to type current location in the search bar, but the keyboard moved on its own. Letters appeared one by one. I wasn't typing. Yet the screen displayed, "Where are you?" A chill ran down my spine. I quickly disabled Wi-Fi, but the connection didn't disconnect. No matter what I did, the signal icon remained. This isn't possible. I glanced around the cafe. Everyone was staring at their screens, reading something, but their eyes weren't moving. Silence spread through the cafe. The only sound was the faint swiping of fingers on glass screens, all in the same rhythm. Then everyone's hands stopped moving. The erased account. I was traveling through Eastern Europe, hopping between small towns, working remotely, and casually checking my social media as usual. That day I was sitting in the hotel lobby, sipping coffee, scrolling through my phone. I went to check my notifications, and I was logged out. Again? It wasn't uncommon for apps to kick me out. I entered my login details, but this account does not exist. What? I tried my phone. Same message. I checked my email. No security alerts, no warnings, nothing. Hacked? I searched my username in the browser, but it was gone. Not deactivated, not suspended, just gone. No posts, no profile, no history. Like I had never been there. I opened a friend's profile and scrolled through their following list. My username wasn't there. I typed it manually. User not found. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe I could recover it. I clicked, forgot password, and entered my email. But this email is not registered. My heartbeat quickened. I opened my phone contacts. Something was wrong. My own number was missing. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. I sent a message to a close friend. "Hey, is my account still up?" A reply came instantly. "Who is this?" I stared at the screen. "What? It's me." "Sorry, wrong number." "Number no, that wasn't possible. We had talked just the other day. I tried another friend. Another. Every single one of them said the same thing. They didn't know me." I ran to my suitcase, ripped it open, and pulled out my passport. And my blood ran cold. The photo was mine. The face was mine. But the name wasn't. My birth date was different. My nationality had changed. Everything was slightly off, like I had become someone else. I rushed to the hotel front desk. "Can you check my reservation?" The receptionist nodded and typed. "Of course, your name?" I told her. She frowned. "I'm sorry, but there's no reservation under that name." My stomach dropped. "I checked in yesterday," I said. She shook her head. "There's no record of you in our system." I yanked out my phone to show my booking confirmation email, but it was gone. I scrambled for my credit card. At least my payment history would prove I was here. I flipped it over, and my breath caught. The name on the card wasn't mine. What is happening? My hands trembled. I could feel the world slipping away. Then, my phone screen went black. A second later, it flickered back to life. A single message appeared. Connection established. And below it, a single question. Who are you? I stared at the screen. I wanted to answer, but I no longer knew the answer myself. The vanishing website. I was traveling through Southeast Asia. As a freelance journalist, writing and publishing articles while moving from place to place was part of my daily routine. That day, I was sitting in a cafe, sipping coffee, and working on my laptop as usual. I finished an article and went to upload it to my site. The page wouldn't load. Server issue again? It wasn't uncommon. I tried accessing the admin panel, but this site does not exist. What? Did my domain expire? No, that couldn't be it. The contract had over a year left. I opened the hosting provider's website to check my account status, but my site wasn't listed anywhere. Wait, no. Panic crept in as I reached for my phone. I tried accessing my site from there. Same result. No trace of my URL. No cached pages. It was as if the site had never existed. This isn't possible. I messaged a friend. Hey, can you check my website? A reply came instantly. What website? The news site I've been running for years. You run a news site? My stomach dropped. Of course I did. I had been writing for it for years. Thousands of readers. Hundreds of published articles. But no one remembered it. I opened social media. I had shared countless links to my articles before, but every single post was gone. My account was deleted. I messaged an editor I had worked with. Are my articles still up on your site? After a moment, they replied. Who is this? I felt my hands go numb. I checked my emails. All past correspondence? Gone. No, this isn't right. I had written those articles. They had been published. They had been real, hadn't they? Desperate, I searched my name online and nothing came up. No bylines, no old posts, no evidence I had ever written a single word. I had been erased. How is this happening? My head spun. Had someone deleted me? Or had I never existed in the first place? Then, my laptop screen went black. What? A restart? I reached for the keyboard, and then white text appeared on the screen. Connection established. A single message followed. Your website never existed. I stared at the screen, unable to breathe.